Kansas Territory, 1855. While every settler raced to build standard log cabins with exterior chimneys to save floor space, one New England farmer was marking out something different. Jonathan Hale staked a 6-foot by 6-foot square dead center of his cabin floor, right where neighbors expected open living space. They called it wasteful, called him a fool. "You're throwing away 36 square feet in a room that ain't big to begin with," they said. He spent 12 days hauling 5 to 6 tons of field stone for interior masonry while they finished their end wall chimneys in 3 days. He positioned his fireplace in the middle of the room, not against the outer wall like everyone else. Then January 1856 arrived with the harshest winter on record. Temperatures plunged to 5 below zero with driving wind. Standard cabins failed. Ice formed on interior walls. Children woke with frost on their blankets. But Hale's cabin, all 4 corners stayed between 54 and 58 degrees through the worst nights. His neighbors burned nearly half a cord of wood per day, just to keep one corner barely livable while he used 40% less fuel and never had a cold spot anywhere in the room. What did this New England farmer understand about heat, stone, and winter survival that frontier wisdom had forgotten? And why did his foolish chimney become the difference between comfort and catastrophe when the real cold came? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Jonathan Hale arrived in Kansas Territory in late April of 1855 with a wagon, 2 oxen, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving 32 New England winters. While other settlers immediately began selecting timber and laying out cabin sites along the Wakarusa River bottoms, Hale spent his first weeks walking the country, noting wind patterns and studying how morning frost lingered in different locations. He had grown up in a Massachusetts farmhouse where a massive central chimney heated 4 rooms from a single stone core, and he carried in his memory the sound of his father's voice explaining why smart men put their fire in the middle of their house, not hanging off the edge like an afterthought. By May, the settlement had taken on the familiar rhythm of frontier cabin raising. Families marked out 16-foot by 18-foot or 18-foot by 20-foot single-pen layouts with mathematical precision, each footprint designed to maximize interior space while minimizing the labor of notching and fitting logs. The standard approach had been refined across decades of westward movement. Raise the walls first, then add an exterior gable-end chimney of fieldstone and clay mortar on the shortest wall. This kept the fire risk outside the main structure and preserved every possible square foot of living space for large families crowded into small quarters. Elias Turner, who had built cabins from Tennessee to Missouri before settling along the Wakarusa, became the informal authority on proper construction methods. A lean, weathered man with hands scarred from axe work and stone laying, Turner had seen enough harsh winters to speak with the weight of experience. He preached the frontier gospel: build fast, build practical, and put your chimney where sparks couldn't burn down everything you owned. "Fire belongs on the outside," he would say, splitting kindling with economical strokes. "If it takes the chimney, you might still save the cabin." When Hale finally selected his building site, on a slight rise above the river bottom, neighbors gathered to watch him lay out his foundation. They expected the familiar rectangle, but Hale surprised them by pacing off a 20-foot by 24-foot footprint larger than most families could afford in terms of logs and labor. Then he did something that stopped conversation entirely. He walked to the center of the marked space and began outlining a 6-foot by 6-foot square with stakes and twine, right where the main living area should be. Turner was the first to speak. "You planning to build around a tree stump you can't move?" Hale shook his head and explained his intention to build a central chimney, a massive stone core that would heat the entire cabin from the middle outward instead of trying to warm the space from one corner. The reaction was immediate and skeptical. 36 square feet represented nearly 8% of his total floor area, space that could hold a bed, a table, or storage for a winter's worth of supplies. In a frontier cabin where every inch mattered, it seemed like an expensive mistake. "You're not in Massachusetts now," Turner said, leaning on his axe handle. Out here, we build fast and fix it later, if we're still here. That rock pile's going to steal all your heat up the pipe and leave you colder than the rest of us. Other neighbors joined the criticism with the easy confidence of men who had done this work before. They pointed out the practical problems. He would burn through 30 to 40% more stone and clay than anyone else in the settlement. A central chimney would require 10 to 12 days of careful masonry work, compared to the 3 or 4 days needed for a simple end wall stack. Most important, the finished chimney would create a permanent obstacle in the center of the room, forcing the family to navigate around it every time they moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Hale listened without argument, then began explaining what he had learned from his father about thermal mass and heat distribution. In the Massachusetts house where he had grown up, a central chimney weighing 5 to 6 tons stored heat from evening fires and released it slowly through the night, keeping upstairs rooms comfortable. Even when the temperature outside dropped near 0 degrees, the key principle was simple. Masonry inside the house gave up its heat to the interior air, while masonry outside the house gave up most of its heat to the wind and weather. Stone doesn't care whether it's in Kansas or Connecticut, he said, driving stakes for his foundation corners. It just knows hot and cold. Put it inside where people live, and people get the benefit. Put it outside, and you're heating the prairie. The neighbors remained unconvinced. Turner had built dozens of end chimney cabins that had sheltered families through winter after winter across the frontier. His method was proven, efficient, and fast, exactly what new settlers needed when racing against the first hard frost. The idea of giving up valuable floor space to accommodate a Yankee contraption struck most men as the kind of theoretical thinking that got people killed when practical survival was at stake. As summer progressed and cabin raising accelerated throughout the settlement, Hale began the slow work of laying his foundation. He dug 18 inches deep and packed the earth hard, then began placing fieldstone in a dry-laid pattern that would support enormous weight. His foundation measured 6 feet by 6 feet and required nearly twice the stone that neighbors used for their entire chimneys. While other families completed their masonry work in a few concentrated days, Hale spent 2 weeks selecting, shaping, and placing stones with the patience of a man building something meant to last generations. The mockery continued throughout the construction process. Men would pause their own work to watch him wrestle massive foundation stones into position, shaking their heads at the wasted effort. "You're building a fort, not a fireplace," one neighbor observed. Turner remained the most vocal critic, predicting that Hale would spend the winter hugging his rock pile just to keep his teeth from chattering. By September, Hale's central chimney began rising above floor level, a substantial stone mass that dominated the interior space exactly as his critics had predicted. The fireplace opening on the main side measured 5 feet wide, large enough to take substantial logs, while a smaller 3-foot opening on the opposite side would serve a back room or bake oven. 2 separate flues ran up through the common stone core, allowing different fires to draw independently without interfering with each other. When the first frost arrived in October, the settlement would finally learn whether Jonathan Hale's middle-of-the-room fireplace was the innovation of a man who understood something about heating, or the expensive mistake of someone who had forgotten where he was and what winter on the Kansas prairie could do to settlers who built the wrong house at the wrong time. The first serious test came on October 15, 1855, when nighttime temperatures dropped into the low 30s in families. Throughout the Wakarusa settlement lit their first real fires of the season. Jonathan Hale had finished his central chimney 3 weeks earlier, and the massive stone core now dominated his cabin interior exactly as his neighbors had predicted. What they had not anticipated was how differently that interior stone would behave compared to their exterior stacks when autumn cold began searching for weaknesses in frontier construction. Hale's evening routine established a pattern that would prove crucial through the coming winter months. At sunset, he built a hot, fast fire using split oak and hickory, driving the flames high enough that the stone faces around his hearth became almost too hot to touch. After 2 hours of steady burning, he would bank the coals and let the fire die down to glowing embers, trusting the heated masonry to carry the cabin through the night. By 10 o'clock, when neighbors were still feeding logs to keep their fires burning, Hale's flames had reduced to a gentle glow against the stone backing. The thermal mass principle that his father had explained in Massachusetts became immediately apparent in Kansas territory. The 5 to 6 tons of field stone absorbed heat during the evening firing and released it steadily through the dark hours like a massive stone battery that stored energy and discharged it slowly. At 4 in the morning, when autumn air dropped to 32 degrees outside, a crude alcohol thermometer on Hale's corner shelf still read 56 degrees, while the stone faces remained warm to the touch along their entire interior surface. Elias Turner's cabin, built with the standard exterior gable end chimney, told a different story during the same October cold snap. The stone stack rose along the outside of his end wall, with roughly half its surface area exposed directly to the night air and prairie wind. Heat from Turner's fireplace warmed the interior face of the chimney, but much of that thermal energy transferred through the masonry and dissipated into the outdoors rather than radiating back into the living space. By dawn, Turner reported that spilled water froze in a shallow tin pan placed near his far wall, indicating interior temperatures in the low 30s, while the area immediately around his hearth remained comfortable at 48 to 50 degrees. The difference in heat distribution became even more pronounced as October nights grew colder and more sustained. Hale could maintain comfortable temperatures throughout his cabin with fires that lasted only 2 to 3 hours, while neighbors found themselves rising twice during the night to add logs and restart flames that had died to useless ash. The central chimney's position meant that nearly all its heated surface area contributed to interior warmth, while exterior chimneys lost substantial energy through their outdoor faces. Dr. Henry Collins, the territorial physician who traveled between homesteads treating seasonal illness and injury, began noting the temperature variations he encountered in different cabin designs. A careful man who kept detailed records of the conditions he found during house calls, Collins observed that families with interior masonry complained less frequently of respiratory problems and seemed to sleep more soundly during cold snaps. Children in Hale's cabin, he noted, could play comfortably in corners that would have been uninhabitable in cabins with end-wall heating. The wood consumption patterns that emerged during October provided the first concrete evidence that Hale's design offered practical advantages beyond mere comfort. While neighbors had cut 8 to 10 cords of hardwood in preparation for winter's demand, Hale had stacked only 6 cords under his lean-to shelter. Turner and others had initially seen this as evidence of poor planning, assuming that Hale would run short of fuel before spring. However, the central chimney's efficiency meant that Hale could heat his larger cabin with shorter firing periods and longer intervals between adding logs. By late October, rough calculations showed that Hale was using approximately 1/6 of a cord during 24-hour periods that required neighbors to burn closer to 1/4 cord for similar interior temperatures. The difference represented substantial savings in the labor of cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking firewood, work that occupied much of every frontier family's autumn preparation time. The mechanism behind these efficiency gains became clearer as Hale explained his observations to Dr. Collins during one of the physician's visits. An exterior chimney, he pointed out, functioned like a stone refrigerator bolted to the outside of the house. Wind and cold weather pulled heat directly from the masonry's outer surface, creating a constant demand for more fuel to maintain interior warmth. The central chimney, by contrast, had no exterior surface area at all. Every square foot of heated stone had to give up its thermal energy to room air before that heat could escape up the flue or through the cabin walls. The social dynamics of the settlement began shifting as October's results became impossible to ignore. Men who had openly mocked Hale's rock pile during construction now asked careful questions about his firing techniques and stone-laying methods. Turner remained skeptical, arguing that a few mild autumn nights proved nothing about performance during serious winter weather, but other neighbors began paying closer attention to how the central chimney actually functioned in daily use. Anders Rasmussen, a Norwegian immigrant with carpentry experience who had built his own cabin using standard frontier methods, spent an evening studying Hale's design and comparing it to the masonry heating systems he remembered from Scandinavia. European builders, he told Hale, had learned centuries earlier that thermal mass belonged inside the living space where its stored heat could benefit the occupants, rather than the outdoor air. The principle was not revolutionary, Rasmussen observed, but it had been largely abandoned by American frontier builders in favor of speed and simplicity. As November approached and the settlement prepared for the first hard freeze, Hale's central chimney had demonstrated clear advantages in heat retention, fuel efficiency, and overall comfort. The question that remained was whether these autumn gains would translate into meaningful benefits when Kansas Territory winter arrived with the full force that old-timers remembered from previous years. Turner continued to predict that serious cold would expose the flaws in Hale's design, but the early evidence suggested that the New Englanders' middle-of-the-room fireplace might prove more practical than anyone had expected. The test of true winter cold would determine whether Jonathan Hale had built an innovation worth copying or an expensive mistake that looked good only during mild weather. The winter of 1855 to 1856 struck Kansas Territory with a ferocity that caught even experienced frontiersmen unprepared. What began as typical December weather transformed into sustained cold that would be remembered as one of the harshest in decades, with sudden temperature drops and driving winds that found every gap in hastily constructed cabins. When a prairie norther swept down from the northwest on January 10th, dropping temperatures from the 20s to 5 degrees below zero overnight, the settlement's building methods faced their most severe test. The standard log cabins that dotted the Wakarusa River country had been built according to proven frontier practice, but that practice had evolved in regions with milder winters and different construction materials. Most families lived in single-pen structures with dirt floors, walls of 8-inch logs, and chinking between the timbers stuffed with moss, mud, or whatever rags could be spared. Door and window openings were covered with oiled cotton cloth or thin wooden shutters that provided minimal protection against sustained wind. These cabins had been adequate for the moderate cold snaps that typically marked winter in the territory, but the sudden arrival of sustained sub-zero weather exposed weaknesses that no one had anticipated. Elias Turner's cabin, built with the exterior gable-end chimney that represented accepted frontier wisdom, began showing problems within hours of the temperature drop. The entire stone stack stood outside the thermal envelope of the building, exposed to wind that drove the effective temperature well below the actual air temperature. As exterior surfaces of the chimney fell to near 0 degrees, the masonry became a heat sink that actively pulled warmth out of the interior fireplace and flue gases. Turner found that he could hold his hand against the interior face of his chimney and feel cold seeping through the stone, as if the outdoor weather were reaching directly into his living space. The heating demands created by this thermal drain forced Turner and his neighbors into an exhausting routine of constant fire tending. Fires had to be fed every 45 to 60 minutes to maintain barely adequate interior temperatures, with families taking turns rising through the night to add logs and restart flames that died quickly in the supercooled masonry. Even with this continuous effort, corner temperatures in end chimney cabins dropped to the high 30s, while areas near the hearth struggled to reach 50 degrees. Children in these cabins began showing the first signs of serious cold stress. Dr. Collins, making his rounds despite the dangerous travel conditions, found families huddled in single corners near inadequate fires, with frost forming on blanket edges and thin ice skimming water buckets placed against exterior walls. The physician noted that parents were burning through their winter wood supplies at alarming rates, some consuming 1/4 to 1/3 of a cord during 24-hour periods of sustained cold. Jonathan Hale's response to the same weather front demonstrated the central chimney's fundamental advantage under extreme conditions. Before the norther arrived, he prepared by firing his massive stone core for 3 to 4 hours, building the flames hot enough that the masonry faces near the hearth reached 150 to 180 degrees, too hot to touch for more than a few seconds. This intensive heating drove thermal energy deep into the stone mass, charging it like a battery that would discharge slowly through the coming night. When Hale banked his coals and allowed the fire to die down, the central chimney began its work as a radiant heating system. The 5 to 6 tons of heated stone had no exterior surface area to lose energy to the outdoor air. Every BTU stored in the masonry had to pass through the cabin's interior space before escaping up the flue or through the walls. The result was steady, even heat distribution that maintained interior temperatures between 55 and 60 degrees throughout the cabin, including corners that remained comfortable enough for children to sleep without additional covering. The efficiency gains became dramatic during the sustained cold snap. While neighbors burned through substantial portions of their winter wood supplies, Hale used approximately 1/6 of a cord during the same 24-hour periods, roughly 40 to 50% less fuel than families with exterior chimneys. This represented not merely an economic advantage, but a survival margin, as running out of firewood during extended cold weather could prove fatal for frontier families isolated by snow and distance from neighbors. The social barriers that had prevented neighbors from acknowledging Hale's success began breaking down when Turner's youngest child showed early signs of frostbite during the worst night of the cold snap. The 6-year-old boy woke, with white patches on his cheeks and fingers that remained numb despite being held near the fire. Faced with a medical emergency that could worsen quickly, Turner swallowed his pride and brought his family to Hale's cabin for shelter. What Turner's family discovered contradicted everything they had believed about heating and interior comfort. The central chimney had created 4 genuinely warm corners, each maintaining temperatures within a narrow band of 54 to 58 degrees despite the sub-zero conditions outside. Turner's children, who had been shivering in blankets around inadequate fires, found they could sleep comfortably in any part of Hale's cabin, well away from the flame itself, but still warmed by the radiant heat from the stone mass. The mechanism behind this even heat distribution became clear to Turner as he observed the central chimney's operation through the night. The heated stone created gentle convection currents that moved air throughout the cabin, preventing the stagnant cold pockets that formed in corners of end chimney cabins. More importantly, the thermal mass continued releasing heat hours after the fire had died to coals, maintaining comfortable conditions without the constant fuel feeding that exhausted families in standard cabins. Hale made no comment about vindication or being proven right. Instead, he quietly set additional logs by the hearth and showed Turner's family where to hang blankets around the central mass to create warm sleeping nooks for the children. The crisis had moved beyond questions of building philosophy to simple human need, and Hale responded with the practical generosity that characterized successful frontier communities. As the cold snap continued through its second and third days, other families began appearing at Hale's door. The central chimney that had been mocked as an obstruction and waste of space now sheltered more people than just its builder, proving its worth not through argument, but through measurable results that meant the difference between comfort and genuine hardship during the worst winter in territorial memory. The blizzard that struck Kansas territory on February 3, 1856, arrived with little warning and lasted 4 days, dumping snow in drifts that reached the cabin eaves and cutting off the Wakarusa settlement from any possibility of resupply or outside help. Wind drove the temperature down to 8 degrees below zero and maintained that brutal cold through 3 consecutive nights, creating survival conditions that tested every aspect of frontier preparation and building design. For families already struggling with inadequate heating and dwindling wood supplies, the storm represented a crisis that would separate successful planning from potentially fatal mistakes. The wood supply situation had become critical throughout the settlement by early February. Elias Turner and other families who had started winter with 8 to 10 cords of split, Hardwood discovered that their constant fire tending had consumed more than half their reserves. Turner's daily wood consumption had reached 3/10 to 4/10 of a cord during the coldest weather, a rate that would exhaust his remaining supply weeks before spring. The prospect of running out of fuel during extended cold weather created genuine fear among families who understood that death from exposure remained a real possibility even inside their own cabins. Hauling additional wood during the blizzard proved nearly impossible and extremely dangerous. Snowdrifts made reaching the nearest timber stands a day-long ordeal, while sub-zero temperatures made outdoor work hazardous for men already weakened by poor sleep and inadequate nutrition. Several neighbors made desperate attempts to drag deadfall logs through knee-deep snow, but the physical cost of such labor in extreme cold threatened to cause more problems than it solved. Jonathan Hale faced the same storm with resources that reflected his central chimney's superior efficiency. Having started winter with 6 cords of hardwood, fewer than most families, he had consumed only 2 cords by February, leaving him with a substantial reserve that would last through any reasonable extension of cold weather. His daily wood consumption during the worst cold snaps remained around one-sixth of a cord, representing a 40 to 50% savings over his neighbors' requirements for similar interior temperatures. The temperature mapping that Dr. Collins conducted during his emergency visits through the blizzard provided the clearest documentation of how different heating systems performed under extreme stress. In Turner's cabin, with outside air at 5 degrees below zero and wind driving the effective temperature much lower, interior conditions varied dramatically by location. The area immediately around the hearth reached 50 degrees when the fire burned actively, but corners farthest from the flame dropped to 35 to 40 degrees. The far wall showed interior temperatures in the low 30s, cold enough that water left in containers overnight developed thin ice films. Hale's cabin during the same weather conditions demonstrated the central chimney's ability to create genuinely even heat distribution. Collins methodically checked temperatures in all four corners of the room, finding readings that fell within a remarkably narrow range. Corner A, near the entry door, maintained 54 degrees. Corner B, directly opposite the main hearth, held steady at 56 degrees. Corner C, by the sleeping area, registered 58 degrees. Corner D, near the smaller rear hearth, remained at 55 degrees. The variation between warmest and coolest areas never exceeded 4 degrees, creating a uniform environment that eliminated the cold spots and drafty areas that plagued standard frontier cabins. The mechanism behind this, even heating, became clear as Collins observed the central chimneys operation throughout the crisis. The massive thermal mass, 5 to 6 tons of fieldstone heated to high temperatures during evening firing, created gentle convection currents that circulated air throughout the cabin. Heat rising from all surfaces of the central stone core established a circulation pattern that prevented stagnant cold pockets from forming in distant corners. Unlike exterior chimneys, which created strong temperature gradients between the heated wall and opposite corners, the central mass distributed its stored energy evenly in all directions. More families sought shelter at Hale's cabin as the blizzard continued, and their own heating systems proved inadequate. Anders Rasmussen arrived on the second night with his wife and 2 young children after their cabin's temperature dropped so low that ice formed along the interior wall seams. The Norwegian immigrant, who had initially built using standard frontier methods, despite his European experience with efficient heating systems, now saw firsthand how proper thermal mass management could maintain livable conditions during extreme weather. Rasmussen studied the central chimney's construction and operation with the eye of a trained carpenter. He noted how the interior placement meant that nearly 100% of the heated stone surface contributed to room warming, while his own exterior chimney lost substantial energy through its outdoor faces. The difference was not merely theoretical, but measurable in terms of fuel consumption, interior comfort, and the ability to shelter additional people during emergencies. The psychological impact of reliable heating extended beyond simple comfort to fundamental questions of survival and security. Families in adequately heated spaces could sleep soundly, maintain their strength, and make rational decisions about resource management. Those struggling with inadequate heating faced exhaustion from constant fire tending, poor decision-making due to sleep deprivation, and the stress of knowing that their situation could deteriorate rapidly if wood supplies ran low or weather conditions worsened. Children responded most dramatically to the temperature differences. In cabins with extreme temperature variations, young people huddled near fires and showed signs of cold stress, including lethargy, poor appetite, and respiratory problems. In Hale's evenly heated cabin, children from multiple families played comfortably throughout the space, slept peacefully in areas well away from the flame, and maintained normal energy levels despite the crisis conditions outside. By the 4th day of the blizzard, when wind finally began to subside and temperatures moderated slightly, the settlement had experienced a definitive test of different building philosophies under life-threatening conditions. Hale's central chimney had not only proven more efficient and comfortable than standard frontier heating systems, but had provided emergency shelter that may have prevented serious injury or death among his neighbors' children. The middle-of-the-room fireplace that had been dismissed as wasteful and impractical had become the community's most reliable refuge during the worst weather in territorial memory. The storm's aftermath would force a fundamental reconsideration of accepted building practices as families tallied the costs of inadequate preparation and began planning improvements that might prevent similar crises in future winters. When spring thaw arrived in March of 1856, the Wakarusa settlement began assessing the winter's damage with the careful attention of people who had narrowly survived a genuine test. The harsh months had left their mark on both buildings and inhabitants, creating clear distinctions between construction methods that had merely endured and those that had actually provided reliable shelter. Families emerged from cabins that showed cracked mud chinking, warped doors from constant moisture changes, and smoke-stained ceilings where overfiring shallow hearths had created incomplete combustion and poor draft. Jonathan Hale's cabin, by contrast, displayed the benefits of steady, controlled heating throughout the crisis months. The central chimney had maintained consistent interior humidity levels that prevented the dramatic expansion and contraction that split chinking and warped woodwork in other structures. His roof showed minimal ice damage because efficient combustion and proper draft had sent heated gases up the flue rather than allowing them to condense and freeze in the cabin's upper spaces. Most importantly, the stone mass had provided a reliable drying surface for wet clothing, tools, and gear throughout the winter, preventing the mold and rot that plagued inadequately heated cabins. The wood consumption tallies that families conducted in early spring provided concrete evidence of the central chimney's efficiency advantages. Turner and other neighbors had burned through 7 to 8 cords during the severe winter, leaving them with dangerously low reserves that would require immediate attention before the following season. Hale had used slightly over 4 cords for the same period, meaning his 6-cord starting supply still provided a comfortable margin for late-season cold snaps and early preparation for the next winter's demands. These practical results began changing building patterns throughout the settlement as families planned improvements and new construction. Anders Rasmussen, whose carpentry skills made him a natural leader in such projects, began advocating for heating systems that incorporated Hale's thermal mass principles. The Norwegian immigrant had recognized similarities between the central chimney design and the masonry heating systems he remembered from Scandinavia, where builders had learned over centuries to maximize the benefits of limited fuel supplies. Rasmussen's first project involved modifying Turner's existing cabin by adding a second room on the opposite side of the exterior chimney, effectively converting the end wall stack into a shared interior heating source. This saddlebag plan, documented in frontier architecture throughout the Ohio Valley and beyond, allowed families to transform their exterior chimneys into interior thermal masses without completely rebuilding their original structures. The addition of a 16-foot by 18-foot room opposite Turner's existing 16-foot by 18-foot cabin created a central heating core that served both spaces while eliminating the heat loss that had made the original design so inefficient. The modification process required careful attention to structural details and proper flue management. Rasmussen and Turner extended the chimney base to support the additional load, then cut a new hearth opening on the opposite side of the existing stack. The shared masonry now provided heating surfaces for both rooms while maintaining separate flues that prevented smoke and draft problems. The converted chimney retained its original capacity while nearly doubling its useful heating surface area. Other families chose to start from scratch, incorporating central or near-central chimney placement into completely new structures. These cabins typically featured larger footprints to accommodate the interior stone mass, with builders accepting the trade-off between floor space and heating efficiency that Hale had demonstrated. The new designs ranged from simple single-pen cabins with centrally located chimneys to more complex multi-room plans where massive stone cores served multiple fireplaces and heating areas. Hale became an informal teacher during these construction projects, sharing the practical knowledge he had inherited from his father's New England experience. He explained minimum chimney base dimensions, 5 feet by 5 feet for smaller cabins, 6 feet by 6 feet, or larger for substantial structures, and demonstrated proper flue sizing, hearth depth, and clearance requirements that ensured safe, efficient operation. His guidance helped other builders avoid the trial and error process that could result in smoking fireplaces, inadequate draft, or dangerous construction practices. The technical principles behind successful central heating became widely understood through these collaborative building projects. Builders learned that thermal mass worked most effectively when placed inside the thermal envelope of the structure, where stored heat contributed to interior comfort rather than outdoor warming. They discovered that proper chimney placement could eliminate cold corners and temperature variations that made frontier cabins uncomfortable and potentially dangerous during extreme weather. Most importantly, they saw concrete proof that initial investments in larger, more complex heating systems paid dividends in fuel savings, improved comfort, and enhanced safety margins. Dr. Collins documented these changes in his medical records, noting decreased incidence of cold-related illness and respiratory problems in families with improved heating systems. Children in centrally heated cabins showed better winter weight retention, fewer episodes of bronchial congestion, and improved sleep patterns that contributed to overall health and development. Adults reported less fatigue from nighttime fire tending and greater ability to maintain productive work routines during cold weather. The spreading adoption of central chimney principles reflected broader patterns in American frontier architecture, where practical innovations often moved from isolated experiments to regional standards within a few building seasons. New England center chimney houses, Pennsylvania German heating stoves, and Scandinavian masonry heaters all represented variations on the same basic understanding. Efficient heating required placing thermal mass inside the living space, where its stored energy could benefit the occupants. By 1858, the Wakarusa settlement showed clear evidence of this architectural evolution. 3 additional cabins featured completely central chimneys built from Hale's guidance, while 4 others had been modified to improve the thermal performance of originally exterior stacks. The changes represented not merely improved comfort, but enhanced survival margins for families facing the unpredictable weather patterns that characterized frontier life in Kansas Territory. The transformation also reflected a broader shift in frontier building philosophy, from emphasis on speed and minimum resource use toward designs that prioritized long-term efficiency and reliability. Hale's patient attention to thermal mass and proper heating design had demonstrated that investing additional time and materials in heating systems could provide decisive advantages when extreme weather tested every aspect of frontier preparation and construction skill. On the frontier, putting the fire in the middle of the house instead of on the edge was not foolish but practical wisdom, a way of saying you were planning to live long enough to see another winter and intended to be comfortable when it arrived.